is Jeran Fraser. In 1999, he launched his first startup during college selling land on eBay. Through this experience, he learned about commercial development, alternative energies, mining, and eventually grew his land portfolio to over 40,000 acres, all while running a summer surf camp with friends and helping to manage the U.S. surf team for Dakine. After a successful endeavor selling land over the internet for over a decade, he rolled his proceeds into several startups, started Incubate Ventures, and has also started a startup himself. He's focused on the consumer goods, the sports tech, and the digital marketing space. Jeran, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
It's good to have you on here. I'm excited to chat. Jeran and I met through a mutual acquaintance, Paul Ang, who I've gotten to know a little bit through my blog on the Circle of Competence. And so I'm grateful for Paul making the introduction because, as everybody's going to hear, Jeran's got a crazy story and one that's both inspirational and there's a lot of lessons that we can learn, and he's going to be willing to share. We've chatted before the podcast, but I'm excited to dig in. So Jeran, why don't you just give us your background, dig in a little bit more, and fill in some of the gray spaces that I left out.
Thanks again for having me. I appreciate it. I just, for me, it's always enjoyable to tell my story. I think I have, some good ideas of what not to do, more than what to do, but I always enjoy speaking about the failures in my life. But going back to it, I grew up kind of a vagabond of sorts. I traveled quite a bit as a child. My family, my mom and dad are both from South Africa. My mom actually had my sister and I here on vacation in the U.S., and then we went back to South Africa, grew up there between there and Southern California for quite a few years. And so I never really spent much time at one school. In fact, I went to, I think 12 or 13 different schools growing up. So it kind of taught me a lot of leadership skills and obviously that builds character as well. There's some negatives and positives to that, of course, but so did that and spent most of my youth in Southern California. And I started my first job at the age of 12 with a paper route, not because of choice, but circumstance. My mom, unfortunately, was not able to make enough money to pay ends meet. So I had to help her out, which again, that's a big character builder in my life and something I look back on and really appreciate having the opportunity to do. In high school, I was very entrepreneurial. My senior year of high school, I was actually flying back and forth from San Diego to San Francisco, helping tear down a shortwave radio station, and with a dream of eventually becoming an electrical engineer. That was a short-lived dream, obviously, but something I at the time enjoyed. And then went to college down at a school called Point Loma Nazarene in Point Loma, San Diego, which was one of the most incredible campuses on planet Earth, and very blessed to get into that school. Not sure how I did looking back on my GPA, but anyway, that was a great learning experience for me. I really took to surfing. I actually was able to start surfing when I was about 15 or 16 in high school, but really got into it in college. And I loved, I've always been one of those people that if I want to learn something, surround myself with the best people. And thankfully at Point Loma, I had a chance to surf with some of the best people in the world. We had I think we had the best college surf team on the planet at the time, with some really talented surfers and that are still great friends of mine. And so, I've always, with anything business or sports, wanted to surround myself with guys that could help me accelerate and learn. And so, fast forward, moved to Hawaii for a year, spent some time there managing a surf shop, and also helping a young boy with cerebral palsy, which I did for about a year, kind of helping him, take him to school. And I was his aide. And that was a very grounding experience for me. Moved back to San Diego, and then 1998 turned 21. And my grandfather, for my 21st birthday, gave me a piece of land, a quitclaim deed, for a property that he was just tired of paying $5 a year in property tax for. And so listening to Napster one day, really diving into what Robert Kiyosaki had to say, I kind of had an epiphany that maybe I could sell this land on eBay. So I put on eBay, I decorated a listing, put some information on the property, and it sold for $800. And that was sort of my launching point into reserve land management. Took me into multiple property auctions over the next, call it year and a half to 2 years. I was literally flying in and out of New Mexico from San Diego every 3 weeks to a month. and really just building that land portfolio up and finding properties that I could flip, and eventually took me to the state of Nevada, where I began acquiring large chunks of land, getting that land surveyed and basically cut up into smaller pieces and sold, and ran that business for about 10 years, which eventually got me into solar, geothermal, and mining.
Well, you're officially my favorite South African entrepreneur now, ahead of Elon Musk. So we'll just make that official. I love your story, because to me it sounds like the true entrepreneur's story of seizing whatever opportunities are in front of you. And so I want to dive into the land business. And how did you, when you sold the first piece of land for $800, what was the second deal, the third deal? Just tell us the progression, and how did you know that could be a viable business?
I guess that's sort of the drive and determination of an entrepreneur. Like when you see an opportunity and you realize that there's something there, and it's just like anything I do today. If there's opportunity, and I will dig in, and I generally just do my best to quickly understand if there's something there, and if not, I move on to the next thing. But in this situation, I was 21 years old, and $800 for me was that could help me perpetuate my surfing around the world, which was my dream. And so I just happened to find out that New Mexico was the only state that had these property tax auctions online. And so I knew I was onto something. And when I flew out, I actually met 4 or 5 of the original sort of pioneers of land selling on eBay. And I was the one young guy who knew how to write some code. So I was doing the HTML listings for eBay, and those guys were all leaning on me. And so we all became this sort of, group of really sharp, real estate guys and I wasn't sharp. I was just a young guy learning from them, but, going across the country and buying land at tax auctions. So that's kind of how it started. And going into my first deal, I don't remember a whole lot. I just remember putting it up there, putting the quitclaim deed together, figuring out how to do it. I didn't know anything about a quitclaim deed. I didn't know the process, learning it all, and then obviously replicating that once I got to that next property tax auction where I was able to acquire 6 to 8 lots.
Let's get into the auction. So your business model originally was buying like foreclosed or properties with tax liens, or basically properties that had been taken over by the city or county just for lack of paying taxes.
So there's lien and deed states across the country. New Mexico happens to be a deed state. So if someone stops paying their taxes after a certain amount of years, those properties then go to tax auctions, at which point the owner can buy at the auction, that property is auctioned off, and the buyer owns that property. There's a short window where I believe the person can actually come back and pay their taxes, but for the most part, it's a short window. Never happened, and that was sort of the model. So buy low and sell high was the model. I think I've been really good at flipping that model on buying high and selling low as of late.
Well, it certainly is. To your point, it is hard to find good deals nowadays, and I don't buy land myself, but I mean, I do know that there are quite a lot of people who have been getting into that as of late. I'm curious, what makes a piece of land desirable? Because I've never bought land or flipped it. I am in the real estate business. I've invested a little bit into small rentals, and then I work in the commercial development space. But talk about what makes a piece of land desirable, and how do you know you can actually flip it for a profit?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to really understand the buying persona because everyone is so different, right? Some people just wanted land in Nevada and they would call it their home for tax purposes. Other people would find a place they just wanted to be off the grid, park an RV and go hang out there for a month out of the year. So we had there was a lot of different reasons, and some was just pure. It was just real estate ownership, right? It's the American dream is to own real estate. And so people would just buy a chunk of real estate. And if they could buy 40 acres for, call it 8 to 10 grand, I mean, for them, it was, peanuts to own a big chunk of ground.
Right. And so you were just basically taking this for, the tax auction, maybe $1,000 or $2,000 and flipping it for 8 or 10. Is that kind of the model? And then just based on volume, doing deals that way?
Correct. That was pretty much the business model. buying, buying. The margins were great back then. Obviously the benefit I had was, obviously eBay was really new. So, and one unique thing about eBay was their, and I don't know if it's changed because I don't do much business on there anymore, but it was $99 to list a piece of land. So if I sold it for 10, I sold properties for 10, 15, 20, $30,000 for cash, and it would cost me $99 to sell it. So it was really unique in that. And then there was other platforms as well, a platform called Bid for Assets, which we also used, and just great platforms that we could list for a fee. I think Bid for Assets charged us a lot more from a commission perspective, but still the value was there, and there was enough margin for that. So it was really unique in that, the internet still new, realist sort of merging that, the internet with sort of this modern day way of selling real estate.
Talk about how and why you grew the portfolio to 40,000 plus acres from more of a transactional model.
So we believed that the initial acquisition we were making was with a private company that had acquired 1 million acres in Nevada. And we had this opportunity to work with them at a really early on once that acquisition happened. And we gained their trust. And so for us, it was about, if we could buy bulk, we could obviously get that price per acre down. And so we were buying in bulk. And we also knew at the time that these counties didn't really have much regulation on splitting these properties from 640 acre sections down to 40 acres. Sadly, I think I was the reason why they put moratoriums in effect, because we were cutting up dozens of sections a year. And for them, it was, I believe, a risk in terms of emergency services. If you're, 15 miles outside a city, they still are, I think, required, from a county perspective to manage that. So if something happens and they can't access it, so they were putting moratoriums in effect for us eventually. But I just realized that I had to buy a big chunk of acreage, and the way the deal was structured at the time, it was really unique. Allowed me to sort of pay off, 5 or 10 sections at a time, and then get those subdivided and sell them.
Got it. So then you transitioned from the transactional model to now we're buying larger sections, subdividing them. Who are you selling those subdivided sections to, and were you making land improvements to them? Just talk a little bit about that.
I think it's a very similar buying persona, to be honest with you. I think it's those looking at, buying these properties for 10 grand and or 15 grand, 20 grand. I mean, 40 acres was selling anywhere from, call it, 8 grand to 25 grand, depending on where they were and what amenities the property had in terms of whether it was utilities or water well. But yeah, rarely did we do improvements before we sold. So we would just basically do a paper subdivision and sell the properties. But we were buying properties that had road access, and so we had properties that were decent properties, and I think attractive in the sense that even a person that was in New York just wanted to have a property in Nevada, and they'd pay the 10 grand for it, knowing that they had ownership to this 40 acre piece of property.
It's so interesting. It is so interesting, and I imagine it's so much more relevant nowadays with COVID and people just kind of, to your point, just wanting to get out of the city.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think we've definitely seen a very big influx and desire for real estate. I mean, I still own several thousand acres in Nevada today, but we definitely have. I think that people really want. Obviously, if close contact spreads COVID, people want to get as far away as they can from people. So, and we're just seeing it. I think we're seeing this push to get outside the cities. And there is the ability to be sustainable as long as you have water or a well and you have solar. I think a lot of people are seeing that land is actually a pretty viable option right now.
Let's dig a little bit deeper into that, because for 2,000 years, cities have more or less continued to sort of grow, 1% here, 1% there, and you compound it over centuries and centuries, and we've got these megacities of today, right? Do you see the combination, not really of a pandemic, but really of a pandemic and remote work and the internet as a potential equalizer to the city? Or is this just like a blip in the road in your opinion? I'm curious, because I know a lot of people fall on different sides of the tracks here.
It's really tough because, you look from a geopolitical standpoint and where things are at, with China, North Korea, Russia, you look at that side of things and you kind of question, well, I just want to have the ability to, if I need to get off the grid, but the grid is pertinent to our lifestyle, right? You and me, we can't live without it. So, when satellite internet becomes a viable place to go, which I think right now, I know Viasat, which happens to be a neighbor down the street, we know them quite well. They're working on some really unique connectivity via satellite that could be cost effective enough for us to really get off the grid. So, it's really interesting. We are handcuffed at the moment to the bigger cities, but I think that as things change, as this, sort of the geopolitics changes outside of COVID, I think there is going to be a desire to get off grid, and of course, I think COVID kind of escalates that a bit.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Well, let's transition. You mentioned solar there, so talk about your experience with solar and how that pairs in with your land business and what you're up to there.
Certainly. So Nevada is a very interesting state. Obviously, a ton of sunshine. We were, early on, I wasn't really looking at solar. Solar was, still, late 90s, early 2000s. There wasn't much happening. I mean, obviously, there was a lot in terms of innovation, but actual large solar facilities, those didn't really happen until like late 2006, 7, 8. And I think there was a green initiative by Obama that pushed a lot of that solar kind of the forefront. Nevada was interesting because there's not a lot of grid in Nevada. So the major grid runs kind of in the central part of the state, and then of course through the Reno area. But if you drive like the Interstate 80 on the north side of Nevada, there just isn't a whole lot of grid. And so when we were buying land, we didn't even think about it, but some of the property we bought was sitting on top of substations and grid. And so some of the stuff just kind of popped up, and we started having people contact us about solar. And so we started doing a ton of research. We even did our own interconnect studies on our own land, trying to figure out the value, and in the process learned a ton about energy and utilities. Nevada was, at one point, it was I think it was Sierra Nevada Energy, and then it became NV Energy, which is now owned by Berkshire Hathaway. And so interestingly enough, what we realized is there's, without knowing people or having liaison to these energy companies, it's really difficult to make these, to get these power purchase agreements in place. But at the same time, we knew that if we kept working on it, we'd have somebody come to us that was in a position to buy the land and do that. So, which we actually did. We had one particular property that we sold at a pretty nice multiple that was on grid, with some real potential. And I think they're actually in the process of securing, or may have already secured, that PPA.
So for people who are totally out of the loop on how solar works, who the players are, what the value chain is, maybe start with just the land, and then what goes on top of the land, who owns what goes on top of the land, how the power is generated, where it goes, and all the players involved, just high level.
That's a great question, and I'm going to be totally honest with you. I don't have a lot of those answers. I was in the business of building what we would call a shovel-ready project, meaning handing it off to the developer that's plugging in the solar panels. Obviously, I know the process in which you have a negotiated agreement with the power company. Whoever the developer is on the project then sells that power back to that, or there's an off taker. Like in our case, it may be a mining company that's 4 or 5 miles south of our company, that they would be an off taker of the energy that you create with that solar. But for the most part, it was just, for us, it was just creating a shovel ready project to hand off. So I can't give you too many details and tell you I'm super knowledgeable there, because I'm not.
No, that's perfect though. That's a solid high level overview of, really, I mean, there's the land player or the landowner, there's the solar developer, and there's the power companies, the utilities.
Yep.
So at this point you had acquired, multiple thousands of acres. At the same time, were you noticing that spreads on land flipping were beginning to get thinner, or were you still doing that, or had you just totally pivoted at this point?
So 2006 or 7 was when things started getting very interesting in the land market. I mean, I had a really good run for about 7 or 8 years. And Nevada got really interesting because several counties obviously were catching on that I was probably the major land seller in most of the northern Nevada counties, and they didn't like it. And I believe that obviously there was one way to combat what I was doing, which was to obviously put a moratorium in effect. So what happened was 2007, there was a major moratorium in several of the counties in northern Nevada, Pershing County, Humboldt County, and then the biggest challenge was I had about a 15,000 acre portfolio of land in a county called Lander County, and they made it very difficult to subdivide, and they've continued to make it very difficult to subdivide. And so even with roads in place, there's just an extra level that they want you to go through in terms of the process of getting these properties cut up. So, but 2007 was actually when the writing was on the wall that things were happening. I mean, literally the phone would ring nonstop until like mid 2007. And I almost remember calling it the day it happened. I was like, something's not right. And so mid to late 2007, I called up a couple of my financial advisors, said, hey, let's go to cash and start buying gold and silver. And they both thought I was crazy. One of them talked me into staying with most of my equities and focusing on not going to cash. And sadly enough, I lost a lot listening to those guys. But at the end of the day, I started pivoting out of land, out of the equities markets into gold and silver. And that's when things actually, the mining world got really interesting for me, and I started actually digging in and learning a bit more about it. But come 2008, obviously when the market crashed, I couldn't give my land away. So it really was at that point in time figuring out what the highest and best use of the land was.
Let's get into that.
So, so 2008 comes, market crashes. At the same time, my wife and I had just gotten married, and we decided that the honeymoon was a great place to get pregnant. So here we are, middle of a financial collapse, and my wife hands me a pregnancy tester, and I'm like, oh man, this is going to be good. So first baby, and I'm trying to sort of put out a ton of fires with my real estate projects. But in the process, I actually had a couple of interesting things happen. I had one large piece of ground I had sold to a geothermal developer. And he wasn't able to make his payments, and I actually had to foreclose on him. And in that, I learned a lot about the geothermal game. And then of course, sort of how energy works from that perspective, and how natural gas prices, whether they were up or down, directly impacted the geothermal market. It was really interesting. So,
but you said he couldn't make his payments. Was this owner financed, or was he making payments to a lender and then you just bought it back from him?
I was owner financed.
Was that typical for your sales when you were transacting, land wise?
Yeah, I would try to be as creative as I could from a finance perspective. So, generally speaking, if they couldn't get bank financing, I would try to somehow structure a deal where I was carrying back a note.
Talk about some terms on the seller note with some of the land deals that you did.
Oh man, I could give you stories for days on that one. We had, it would all depend on who the buyer was. If it was a big company, working on a big project, I would just look at sort of, my short-term and long-term objectives in that deal. But I would do a $250,000 carryback where someone puts down 30% and I carry back at 8% interest for 5 years, or interest only with a balloon payment. So we would do all sorts of things like that. We would do a 10-year deal where for 10 years, put down $500 and carry back and fully amortize over 10 years. So also we did all sorts of kind of carry back deals.
Yeah. It sounds like you guys just got creative with what the seller may have needed, what you guys wanted, and just tried to make it work.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Back to the mining. You've got this acreage, trying to figure out the highest and best use. Talk about how, from the experience with the geothermal developer, you got into that and mining.
So yeah, it's interesting. So we had one chunk of ground, particular chunk of ground, in a little town called Crescent Valley, Nevada. We were I think this is 2011. We had a couple of guys, 2010 or 11, we had a couple of guys asked to buy the land. And, and then I told them the price, and they said we didn't have the money. And then he came back 2 months later and asked us again. And then finally, by the third time, I said, well, what are you guys looking to do? And he said, we're looking to mine gold. And of course, in my mind, I'm like, I see dollar signs. I didn't see the money pit that was ahead, but I saw dollar signs. So in hindsight, I've learned do something you know, don't do something you don't know. But anyway, so and of course I wanted to learn the game of mining, so I partnered up with these guys. We structured a really unique deal. They had a bunch of mining claims. Our land was next to mining claims, and then we built a contiguous project of about 4,500 to 5,000 acres, and it was actually happened to be right next to one of the highest grade gold mining projects in the U.S. And so, for the next several years, the idea was, how do we get this to take this property to the next step? And what most people do from an gold exploration perspective is actually go public, raise public capital, go stick holes in the ground, and then eventually you'll find either a joint venture partner or someone to acquire you. Sadly, we decided to keep it private because we were trying to be ethical and honest humans in this whole business. And so for us, it was, let's bootstrap this thing. Let's put holes in the ground. So eventually we put some holes in the ground, found some great science, took it to our neighbor. Neighbor liked it. We got into a deal, and things kind of went sideways in the deal. And so we're still dealing with that as we speak. I'm not going to get into too much, but sadly, it's one of those learning experiences. When I tell people I own a gold exploration company, it sounds very, very amazing, but it's in hindsight, I would have never done it if I had a chance to understand what was going to happen. So
It sounds like you've learned quite a bit.
Yes, I definitely haven't. In fact, just touching on it, I know we haven't got into the conversation yet, but in that span of time, actually, I built LandHub, and I know you were going to ask about that a little bit, but do you want any specifics on that, or do you just want to jump into that?
No, that's a good segue, because to your earlier point, the 2000s was when the technology sector started merging the online with the offline, right? Like the Amazons of the world, the e-commerce of the world, the online marketplaces of the world. And so I think that's a perfect segue into how you got into tech as well. So maybe talk about, your interest in technology, and again, the opportunity that you saw, took advantage of, and just talk about LandHub and what came of that.
Perfect. So 2009 was a very, I suppose, fairly dark time from a business perspective for me, where I kind of had to do a mental reset. So it was a time for me to really understand tech. I had been in real estate for so long, and I realized that the new real estate was page one of Google. And so I really stuck some time into understanding how to build websites. I obviously knew how to write some code from my college days, and so I dug into building WordPress sites and HTML sites back then, and really tried to figure out what that next layer of technology was in that land game. And so 2011, 12, obviously I knew that there was a bunch of land sites out there that were ranked. And so I acquired a company, I think in 2012, called Rural Property Finder. And it had a really unique PHP site that was generating some SEO and just hadn't been managed correctly. So I brought on a pretty smart CTO here in San Diego to kind of help guide me into the next piece of what that was going to be, which my vision was real estate in general, single family homes, they were syndicated on all sorts of sites. Once it hit the MLS, it's syndicated. Well, for land, people didn't usually list with a realtor. They would go to Craigslist, or they would go to a marketing website like LandWatch or Lands of America to list a property. And sadly, there was no way to syndicate to all of them. So what I was doing is I was building a back-end marketing platform that was basically a syndication model that you could build this HTML file, and it was syndicated to all these different websites. So that was the vision of LandHub. In the process, I kind of got into some investing in some other local tech companies in San Diego. So I built LandHub. I acquired domain, built out LandHub with some of the assets from the former website, and then just refaced it all. And then eventually actually found a buyer for that. And site's still running today with a team of several employees, and they're doing well.
That's awesome. So you ended up selling that business.
Yep.
And talk about, rolling those proceeds into either Incubate, or was it other startups?
Yeah. So that's kind of right. That transition was right where I really got into wanting to, these few investments that I had made, wanting to bring them all into a single space. I 2012, 13, I got into mentoring at um, a local accelerator, nonprofit accelerator here in San Diego called San Diego Sport Innovators. So that for me was sort of the deep dive into helping and educating myself on sort of the startup process, because I didn't know a whole lot in terms of raising capital. I just knew that I had written checks as an angel investor, but not the other side of it. So I really got to dive in, see some of these local startups in San Diego, and be part of a crew of people that were really helping accelerate these sports startups locally. So did that. And at the same time, I built my first small space called Collab Loft, which was the sort of start of Incubate Ventures. And Collab Loft was about 4,000 square feet. I brought companies in to pay rent, and then I also subsidized other companies in exchange for equity, and or I would make a capital investment in these companies. That then subsequently grew into about a 17,000 square foot space of a building I acquired in Carlsbad a couple of years after that. Grew that to about 17 or 18 different companies, and made several investments, at which time I also started a sports technology company. And that was sort of my transition out of sort of the real estate market and really into focusing on investments. And although I say that, I was still heavily involved, like the commercial acquisition of the building. I'm still doing real estate, but it's not my primary job. It was more focusing on the investments I was making, and obviously that sports tech company stack that we created within Incubate Ventures.
Yeah, I kind of look at the broad arc of your story, and I don't see you as necessarily a real estate guy. I see you as like a company builder, and real estate happened to be your first medium through which you were doing your thing. And so you're still involved, obviously, in the land management business to an extent,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
But primarily you focus on Incubate Ventures and Stacked. Tell us about Stacked and the market opportunity there, and what led you to start that sports app.
Yeah. So I didn't get into it too much, but I have a bit of a surfing background. I obviously enjoyed surfing a ton in college. As mentioned, I surrounded myself with some great guys. In college, I also had a little surf school that then became a little role in a company called Dakine, where I shared responsibilities of running the regional U.S. surf team for Dakine, which is really cool. And I was definitely not qualified to run a surf team. I would say I'm mediocre at best at sports. I just, but I did enjoy hanging out with some of the best guys in the world because I loved learning. So, but it was cool. It was a really unique position. The company was thriving, and I got to be part of a really cool company that was growing in the surf world. And so I then also made an investment into a surf brand that I eventually acquired called Famous, which is part of our portfolio at Incubate. And when I got into the sort of tech side of sports, we realized that surfing was actually missing technology. And so I had met a gentleman that I played basketball with who happened to be a really talented developer from France. And I had helped him through that mentoring program. I had mentioned SDSI with a mobile gaming company that he had built called U-Riding, which was a mobile surf game. Very successful game. And then as he parlayed out of that game, him and I came up with the concept of providing a live scoring solution for people that could not afford it. So basically creating a suite of software tools that they could run on the beach or wherever they were to track the scores, and then provide a way to distribute those on either a website and eventually what became an app. So we built this really unique scoring. It's called our event manager, Stacked Event Manager, that basically allows the event to run. You can track everything from athlete registration all the way up to seating ranking, and then obviously controlling live scores and live streaming. And so then we built this consumer-facing app where it's basically your LinkedIn as an athlete, where it tracks all your data. You have your own profile. You can follow other athletes if you're a consumer, and just following athletes. Or if you're an athlete, you can add different layers into your profile. And obviously when COVID hit, it was really interesting because we were about to lock in some pretty big deals in a couple of different industries like soccer and rugby. And obviously when sports turned off, it was really tough for us because we had to let go of our team. But then we started getting some interesting calls about a month in going, hey, we don't have the money to build our own app. Can we use your technology? So what we did starting in April was actually we began private labeling our technology, but then all of it it's basically a channel for our app. So all that data goes back to the main app, so you can watch any event in real time, live streamed or live scored. But then you can go to that organization's app by itself. So we are working with some very high level rugby guys at the moment, which is exciting. Also in soccer, and this is not just US, but also global. So really interesting for us, becoming a really unique opportunity, kind of post COVID. So that's cool for us.
That's awesome. Yeah, it sounds like almost like a ESPNU, but also from everything from youth all the way up to professional, for both the fan and the athlete, and then also layering in a component of like social networking in there as well.
Exactly. Yeah, our focus was tier 2 sports that just didn't have the capital to fund their own projects, and there just really isn't. In sports in the U.S. is very fragmented in terms of technology. A lot of big companies were acquiring technology just to own the consumer, to sell them some other type of product rather than to focus on the experience. And so we really came in and said, we're going to take the bull by the horns and really focus on the experience for both the athlete and consumer.
Got it. Now, are your customers like the leagues for the sports, or are they the athletes themselves, or the consumer, or all the above?
All the above. So the league comes in and wants to have an app for his league or organization. And then the athlete wants, the athlete is who we're selling to, and the consumer, by offering, your ability to watch live stream, or, any upgrades you put in there. That's who we're targeting, but the league and the organization is ultimately what we're going after, because they provide our access directly to that athlete and consumer.
No, that's a good point. I was actually just thinking about that as I asked the question. It would make sense to try and basically go after the league, because if you get the league, you get the content, you get the athlete and the consumer.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
I got a couple questions on the co-working space, and then we can hit the final questions and wrap it up.
Yeah.
What in your mind, because I've always been interested in this, I was always actually fairly bearish on WeWork just based on their financials and just their behavior and mismanagement.
Yep.
But I like the concept of co-working.
Yep.
And so what in your mind makes a co-working space stand out?
Gosh, that's a tough post-COVID question. I think we're going to be in for some interesting things moving forward. Of course, you've got talks of a COVID vaccine, which I'm not sure how they've got something ready in 5 months, but hey, whatever they say. I just don't. I think that the post-COVID, in fact, I would call it COVID working, not co-working, is going to be a challenge. I love the concept of working creatively in open spaces and collaborating. I think that the problem now is we've got a big roadblock in the way. I know several friends that own co-working spaces that are all filing bankruptcy. So sadly, the WeWork model doesn't really count. I've been following that model for several years. Was never a big fan. It was a sort of a premium model of Regus. I called it a Regus on steroids, with really pretty glass windows. But at the end of the day, your price per square foot was way too high, and eventually you start pricing people out, going and pushing them back to their own space. So, and it happened several times, because they were giving away free rent, here in San Diego at some of their WeWork facilities, and people were walking away after a year because they got great deals, because they were pushing their rents up 5 or 6x. So I'm not very bullish on co-working moving forward, to be honest with you. I loved the concept for several years. I just think it's going to struggle post-COVID, because people would rather now not take a chance and work from home than go into a collaborative environment, in my opinion.
So you think working remotely and working from home is to a large part here to stay, versus a more of a collaborative co-working space?
Yeah, I could be wrong. I just don't know how the whole COVID vaccine and people's comfort is going to play out in all of this. I don't know. I just feel like there's a subset of the population that's very fearful that that walking into a co-working space is going to elevate the risk of getting COVID. And sadly, obviously, we've proven with statistics that that's not necessarily the case. That you are, that if you're 6 feet apart and there's good airflow in a space, whether it's indoors or outdoors, that you're going to be okay. But at the end of the day, it's I just don't know where the mindset is around all of that and where it's going to go. But I'm not very bullish at the moment.
I'm not much for putting my head in the sand, but when it comes to the modern day media, that's pretty much the approach that I take.
Smart man.
I've got one more question on the consumer brands that you deal with. Talk about, in your mind, what makes a good consumer brand? I know you said that you've purchased and you own a surfing brand. Do you own any other brands? And in your mind, what makes a good, wholesome, profitable, sustainable, Modi consumer brand?
That's a loaded question. Golly, in today's day and age, what it takes to be a brand, gosh, I mean, it's moving at warp speed, right? 4 years ago, if you were really good at building Instagram content, that was how you built a brand. Today, it seems like it's more politically driven. If you pick a political side in building your brand, generally you have a little bit more of an advantage. If you take the wrong side, I think it tends to be very impactful from a negative perspective. It's really interesting. I work closely with several influencers from sports to Hollywood, and it's interesting learning from them, sort of like how they're paid by marketing, or what people spend to get an influencer to say something or do something on their social media for a product. But I think that we're going to get into just some interesting things. TikTok. I think TikTok, there's a risk that TikTok goes away. I know several influencers that have big TikTok followings that sure, they're nervous, but at the end of the day, they've built a significant following on other platforms. But it's interesting. I mean, all this stuff is, I feel like it's so hard to rely on somebody else's platform. It was like eBay. If eBay went away, how do I sell land? That was always sort of my fear, is that at any moment in time, everything we rely upon, if the internet goes away, how do we do business? So if these different platforms go away, marketing today is built around social media. So it's a very interesting time, and especially now because everyone's at home and they're consuming by not going out and seeing things at the store, because they don't go to the store, they see it online. And so it's I don't know, it is going to be, trying to sort of even look 12 months from now at what could happen, or what's going to happen from a brand building perspective. I don't even know. It's crazy.
Yeah, that you make some good points, that nowadays the consumer brand depends on the social media marketing, and the social media marketing depends on the influencers, and the influencers depends on where they fall potentially on the political spectrum, or what they've accomplished already, and whether they've got a big following, and how do they get there. And so there's all these contingencies where if one link in the chain, if it seems to break, maybe the brand breaks, right? So,
correct.
And it is interesting, your last point, that everyone's at home looking at this content, and all the brands are out there pumping this stuff out. So, it's, how do you stand out, right?
Yeah.
So,
and just to add to that, the modern day consumer that's called 16 to 25, they're basically numb to marketing. There's nothing that phases them. So I think that brand loyalty is going to eventually sort of go away, right? Things are going to be cool for a year, and then what's the next cool thing? And I think that that's sort of what's happened, right? Back in the day when we didn't have social media, you stuck with the brand for life. Like, you loved a brand. If you were all about a Ford truck, that was it. I'm driving Fords only, or a Chevy guy, whatever it was, you were all about that. Today, I think we're so bombarded with content, and our ability to process all of it has just made us numb to marketing. So, and I've seen this big time in the younger generation, and it scares me a bit, because I kind of wonder, like, how our brands, are we going to go to a Walmart world where it doesn't matter what it is, it's just the cheapest thing in the room, and that's what we're buying.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, maybe a word of encouragement there. I do think one thing that I have seen is super niche brands that are high quality. 99% of the people aren't going to care about you because they're not looking for what your product or service offers. But the people that are in that niche, if you're high quality, I actually saw something from Benedict Evans, who's an ex-VC guy. He said that on Google, people were searching for higher quality things, not cheapest things, over time.
Absolutely.
So something that's just an interesting tidbit there.
Yeah.
So,
And I 100% agree with you. I think the biggest challenge is marketing that higher quality, right? How do you know that Chinese product isn't the same quality, or that other company is higher quality? And to get there, that's an expensive sort of marketing cost that you've got to build into your product. So that's the challenge, right? Like I think the challenge we're all facing is like, can you provide enough content to convince the consumer that your product really is a higher quality? So again, we're marketing 101. We're in like marketing 1,000,001 right now because it's changed so fast in the last 20 years. It's just really hard to see where it all goes.
I agree. Yeah, things are changing super fast, and COVID hasn't done anything to slow anything down.
No.
All right, let's wrap up. Let's get to the final questions. So, what personal values or beliefs are most important to you, and how do they inform your day-to-day business?
Great question. One thing I've kind of always grown up with sort of a spiritual root when it comes to business and life. I've always been a super ethical person in business. I won't do anything that sort of crosses that ethical boundary for me. So if it's gray, I'm usually not touching it. I kind of have this thing where if it's a win-win-win for everyone, I'm happy to get involved. But I'm very careful if I do business with a partner. There has to be a necessity for me to want to do business with a partner and a trust factor. I've been burned many times over the years by being an honest guy. But at the same time, I've also learned a lot of hard lessons. So I would say that, just being sort of spiritually rooted in a biblical way, I just struggle sometimes with ideas that come across my desk that go, man, that sounds really attractive, but I can't do it.
Yeah, and I commend you, because that takes some serious discipline to look at something that it is attractive and still say no. I think that's probably one of the biggest secrets to success that I've gotten advice on, is you got to learn how to say no. And I will admit I'm pretty terrible at that. So I'm learning. What advice would you give yourself before starting out as an entrepreneur?
What advice? That's a good question too. I think that I would definitely say, first off, obviously fail fast and fail forward. I think that take as many risks as you can when you can, because the risk changes as you get to a point where you're having a family, a wife, and children. You begin to look at things a little bit differently and begin to be a little more risk averse. But I would say take the risks because you can. Certainly as a younger person, which is what I did. But never stop taking risks. Never stop asking questions. Never stop learning.
I like the last piece. Never stop learning. That's great. What's one thing you would have done differently now that you're a few decades into your journey as an entrepreneur and investor?
I would have probably, when I was really young in business, I didn't surround myself with a mentor. I don't think even if I had a mentor back then, I wouldn't know if they would have known how to deal with my crazy brain of buying and selling land on eBay. But I would have said, find a mentor and lean on somebody that you can trust. I didn't really have that growing up with reserve land, because I just wasn't out there seeking it. And in hindsight, had I done that, I probably would have had an exit pretty early on with that. And so, I would say just find people you can trust, let them mentor you, and trust what they're saying.
It's good. What person would you most like to meet who's alive today, and what would you want to talk about?
Wow, man, oh man, that's a really tough question. I'm gonna say, oh dude, I can't say it. I can't say it, Benton. Can't do it. I'm just gonna say it. I'll do Bill Gates. I would love to sit with Bill Gates. I think he's probably in a bunker in New Zealand right now, but I would love to sit with him right now and just ask him why he's so involved in the vaccine process of COVID. It just seems so interesting. And he had mentioned he's been very successful in this nonprofit world of creating vaccinations. So I just would love to learn the business side of it, why he's so interested in it. So that'd probably be the guy.
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates.
If you're listening. You can't be involved in any of the current startup industries that you are that you're currently involved or invested in, what other startup sub-industries or sub-verticals would you be involved in?
Got it. I think I'm a marketing guy through and through. So I think that if I was to do something, I think my next thing would probably be a content creation or a marketing agency. I come up with some off the wall ideas sometimes, probably some that would do terrible, but others that I think would do really well. So I think it's probably what I do. I'd focus on, helping probably influencers, and also just work on, sort of content creation.
I love it. What's the biggest challenge in your life personally and professionally, and how are you attempting to tackle it?
Personally, that's a great question. Personally, I have a 12-year-old son who is autistic or on the spectrum. He's a very challenging person for me personally, and raising kids is hard. But it's a challenge that I embrace and I love, and my wife and I really focus on trying to be better parents and trying to raise God-fearing boys that will be really successful once they become adult men. So that's kind of, the personal challenge there is just sort of raising kids and just, putting the pressure on myself to be the best dad that I can be. Professionally, right now, it's just getting better at putting out fires, because there's a lot of COVID fires at the moment. And I'm really trying to kind of hone in my skill set on putting those fires out and doing so in a way that's beneficial.
How can someone listening to the podcast add value to your business or businesses?
Man, you know what? To be honest with you, to add value would be to add value to society. Is to love others, to help others, to give back. I think that one of the biggest things I learned was I didn't really have an agenda in life. My agenda was basically just to give. And obviously in return, I've been given a lot. So I would always say, to add value to what I do, I would just say, add value to yourself by giving back, which then adds value to society in general.
That's a great way to wrap up. Jeran, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. We'll talk soon.
Sounds good, brother. Appreciate it. Thank you.
This is Benton here again. Thanks so much for listening to the Circle of Competence podcast. To find more episodes like this one, go to circleofcompetence.co. That's circleofcompetence.co to sign up for my weekly podcast emails, as well as a monthly summary of links to blog posts and articles I liked most from the previous month. Finally, if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating on iTunes, which will help more people discover the work we are doing to explore the entrepreneurial investor's journey. Thanks again for listening.